So how do you prefer to watch your films? Would you prefer to go to a theater, or would you rather watch on a television, whether it's cable television or broadcast television? Or do you prefer DVDs? Do you own films or do you rent them? Or do you prefer to stream your movies from the internet, from somewhere like Amazon or Netflix? The film industry is based on a three-pronged structure. That would be production, distribution, and exhibition. This system began in the early days of the film industry and still remains the structure used today. However, the internet threatens distribution and home theaters threaten exhibition. By 2006, less than 15% of American film revenues were earned from movie ticket sales, while more than 85% came from licensing or selling movies for use in the home. Until recently, DVDs dominated the market, and that's why many films were made to go direct to DVD. So what happens to that big screen experience? How many of you watch movies on a mobile device, or at home on a big screen high definition TV with surround sound, or have a home theater, perhaps not quite as nice as in this picture, but same setup with a high definition television and surround sound? Moving pictures actually started with a bet. Leland Stanford, yes, that's the Stanford of Stanford University, placed a $25,000 wager that all 4 feet of a galloping horse left the ground. In comes Edward Muybridge, and who proved this by setting up 24 different cameras along a racetrack, and he used a cord-triggered release to capture the motion of the horse. And it showed the feet did leave the ground, but this also set up the possibility of creating motion pictures. So before we begin the chronology of the film industry, go to your Dominic textbook, page 229 and page 230, and you'll see a chart that shows where the motion picture is today, and it also looks back at its beginnings and it gives you a timeline. In 1889, Edison and his assistant Dickson invented what's called the kinetoscope, or the first motion picture viewer. They put this in a nice wooden box, and it cost the viewer 1 cent to watch a looping black and white short film, but it had no sound. These went hand in hand with vaudeville shows in theaters. In France, 2 brothers, Louis and Auguste Lumière, created cinema, or projected moving pictures on a screen. They began trying to figure out how to combine film recording and projection into a single device. In 1895, Louis Lumière came up with the solution, a 3-in-1 device that could record, develop, and project motion pictures. Cinematography would go down in history as the first viable film camera. One of their first films, which was shot with a single stationary camera at a train station, and it was shot down low almost from the level of the track. It showed the train coming into the station, so it looked like it was coming right at the audience. There's an urban legend that says some people actually got up and panicked and either ran to the back of the theater or ran out because they thought the train was going to come bursting through the screen and come right at them. In 1903, Edwin Porter made a film called The Great Train Robbery, which is known as the first actual motion picture. It was a 10-minute film, and it was the first that told a story. Porter used a number of innovative techniques, including composite editing, camera movement, and on-location shooting. This film is one of the earliest to use the technique of cross-cutting, where 2 scenes appear to occur simultaneously but in different locations. Also in this decade, peep shows, or short films watched through viewfinders, led to development of feature films because people wanted more and more, and they wanted longer films, and they liked the storytelling feature. So the next development were actually the first theaters are called Nickelodeons. These were small storefront theaters, but usually not the most attractive and definitely not comfortable, as they generally had benches or uncomfortable wooden chairs. This raised the number of independent filmmakers due to this growing demand for new movies. So the big wigs were getting a little nervous, and about 1908, Edison created a trust with 9 manufacturers. They called this the Motion Pictures Patent Company, or the MPPC. It was a monopoly that standardized production technologies, controlled raw film production, manufacture of motion pictures, and projection equipment, as well as distribution and exhibition. The producers had to pay patent fees and taxes to Edison to use equipment, and then they had to agree to use George Eastman's film. Well, the independents got a little radical and they decided to use bootleg equipment to avoid having to pay these fees and royalties and taxes. And they also decided they were going to flock to the West Coast, specifically to Hollywood, because better weather meant filming could take place all year round. However, the trust was broken up by the government in 1915 because it led to unfair business competition. But the benefits of the MPPC are that it's standardized in advanced movie technology. Think of computers today with Microsoft, Apple, and IBM and what they have done to create the competition in personal computers. D.W. Griffith created the first major feature film called Birth of a Nation. It was first shown in New York's Liberty Theater in March of 1915. Some considered Griffith a genius. He used close-ups, fade-outs, montages, or groups of shots that created really powerful images. So his techniques were extremely innovative and popular, yet the subject of the film was not quite as popular. It was originally made to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, yet it was very racist in content. It involved the Ku Klux Klan. Although it yielded more than $5 million on an investment for production that cost less than $100,000. Keeping with the racist tradition, the first film with sound, called a talkie, was The Jazz Singer, which starred actor Al Jolson. This came out in October of 1927, and RCA provided the sound. In the film industry, there's been two systems: the star system and the studio system. As more films were made, actors developed their own fan base, so this meant that they could demand more money per film. Some examples you'll see here are Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin. Fans also wanted longer films and not just shorties. The end game was that these actors and some filmmakers, for example, here you'll see Pickford, Fairbanks, Chaplin, and D.W. Griffiths, banded together to create United Artists. This gave them more control over their own work. Longer films also meant moviegoers wanted a more comfortable place to watch, which led to the demise of those uncomfortable Nickelodeons and rise of large movie theaters and beginning of the studio system. The studio system began once the industry had almost completely moved to the West Coast to Hollywood. The studio owners began to create their own theaters, so they controlled all three levels of the film industry. Again, that's production, distribution, and exhibition. And this was called vertical integration. Some of these tactics included block booking, which was detrimental to the small independent theaters because they had to rent 2 to 3 A films, which were the high-budget popular films, as well as agree to show 5 to 6 B films, which were low budget, lower quality. So the studios now owned the stars and kept them under contract. For example, they told them how they could dress, the makeup they could wear, the parties they could go to, all those kinds of things. By the 1930s, there was only 5 major studios: Warner Brothers, Loews, Paramount, RKO, and 20th Century Fox. In 1939 to 1941, 2 movies that were the first to be made in color, or that had color, were Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Citizen Kane also came out in that period, which is today called the best American film ever made. 1946 was the peak year of movie attendance, when an average of 90 million Americans, or about 75% of the population, went to the movies each week. This was probably because we were just coming out of a war and people wanted to get out and celebrate and have some quality entertainment. The ruling of the legal case U.S. versus Paramount in the late 1940s forced these companies to divest themselves of theater chains and limited vertical integration that had been going on for about 30 years. This ended block booking as well as fixing of admission prices, as it was a restraint of trade. The 1950s brought out television, which gave films some pretty tough competition. And everyone resisted at first, but then they co-opted, and Hollywood became the center of television production, and so they also made movies that were specific to television. And you'll also see some on this slide that or post-World War II period that the stars started to move away from the studio system, had a little more freedom, as well as independent filmmakers. Foreign films became very popular. Films began to take on more of an artistic value rather than everyone trying to go for the blockbuster like Gone with the Wind. In the response to the popularity of television, all different types of techniques came out to try to compete with them. And when they realized they couldn't compete, they just said, we're going to cooperate and join them. HBO, or home box office, began in 1972 and was accessible for those who had cable television. This was the first time that subscribers could see movies after their theatrical release. There were 4 popular types of foreign films. Soviet social realism films were like, for example, came from Sergei Einstein. Battleship Potemkin, which was propaganda. French surrealism was Buñuel and Salvador Dali, and they worked with Disney. Italian neorealism were sort of like the Soviet films, although they were without propaganda, and they tended to be very realistic. For example, The Bicycle Thief by Vittorio De Sica. The French New Wave films is where a director becomes an auteur and maintains a very personal style. So here you have the whole progression of viewing films, beginning with Nickelodeons all the way down through home theater and projection TVs, widescreen TVs. In 1952, the Supreme Court granted First Amendment protection of expression to films and film developers, whereas films were previously considered only simple amusement. Now they were telling stories that perhaps were a little controversial. The Americans also began fighting against censorship. The main genres of films were westerns, comedies, musicals, gangsters, war, and of course Disney. We also had films that contained a lot of social realism, such as Streetcar Named Desire. Films tend to depict the life of minorities, whether it's framed in a positive or a negative way. In the 1980s, we had a huge growth of African American, Latino, and Asian directors. So there's a lot of films that were directed specifically to tell stories relative to those cultures, races, and also specific religions. In the early days, film audiences were mostly families, then teenagers. Today, audiences are mostly teenagers and aging baby boomers. Why? Movie viewership's getting older, but teenagers are considered the most viable audience. So you'll see films directed more towards those 2 demographics. From an international perspective, the countries listed on the slide here all have their own cinema. Hollywood still dominates, but it relies on international sales to boost profits, especially of its action films, which are very popular in other parts of the world. However, India makes about 800 films per year. It's more than any other country, including us in the United States. They call this Bollywood. These 4 films are considered the best pictures ever made. Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, and the Godfather series, which especially the Godfather 1 and the Godfather 2. So, what are your favorite films? What are your favorite genre? And how do you prefer to watch your films? And do you think that's going to change in the next 5 years?